his homework. He has sifted the evidence. He has interviewed eyewitnesses. And so what Luke is saying, what I present to you, what I give to you, what I tell you, you can take it to the bank. You can rely upon it. It's trustworthy. I've looked into it in great detail so that you can be assured that what you're getting is the truth. Now, Theophilus, having learned from the gospel all about Jesus, the miracles of Jesus, the sermons of Jesus, the life and the ministry of Jesus, the death and the resurrection of Jesus, now he wants to know, well, I'm seeing in the cities of the Roman world these new groups called Christians, these followers of Jesus. What are they up to? What do they understand? What do they stand for? What is their position? And so we begin with the basics. Now, the author of this, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, going back to the earliest days, is universally agreed to be Luke. Now, the second question is, where was it written? I think it's fair to say that Luke started to make notes about this as he accompanied Peter and as Peter was sent to Rome to be on trial before the emperor. So I think he probably began to put it down in detail when Paul firstly was under house arrest in Rome, and Paul had a certain amount of freedom, and then later on he was put into the cells under the royal palace. Now, Luke's writing style is not only accurate, it's stylish. He writes the best Greek in the New Testament. And several people can testify to the accuracy of Luke's writing. Way back in the Victorian era, there was a professor called Professor Ramsay. He did his studies at Oxford University. He had an Oxford PhD. He was an archaeologist, and he was an atheist. And he set out to go to the Holy Land to examine the landscape, to gather the evidence, and he was sure as an archaeologist he could prove that the New Testament was a whole tissue of lies. It was all myths and legends and nonsense, all cobbled together. And he went with that express purpose. He left Victorian England, he journeyed there, and because of what he learned, he began to see the accuracy and the honesty and the integrity of the New Testament. And he was wonderfully converted. He continued to be an archaeologist. He continued to be a historian. He returned back to Oxford. And Ramsay was a great influence in the Victorian church. Of course, he was a Church of England man, an Anglican, and so on. But he wrote a number of books stressing the accuracy and the reliability of the New Testament based on what he had found. A more recent individual, Dr. F.F. Bruce, who was a professor at Manchester University, praises Paul, for instance, for his detailed account and his reliability of his writings and his accuracy. And when I was doing my research, I discovered that there was at least one person I found who had written a PhD thesis on Luke's use of medical language in the Gospel and in the Acts of the Apostles. Again, firming up the whole idea that Luke was a doctor. He was a medical doctor, and that he uses language. You know, we say to one another, or we say to our husbands or wives, well, I think I have the flu. The doctor tells you you have influenza. They use the right terms, the right words. We just use the common expressions. Well, in the Gospel and in the Acts of the Apostles, Luke uses, as a doctor would, very clear medical terms. We'll see it when we come to the first miracle. And so Luke is not only accurate in his writing, but he writes in the best classical, stylish Greek in all of the New Testament. Now, Luke is mentioned 6 times in the New Testament. And there are 3, as we will see as we get into the book, there are 3 extended passages where Luke stops being a secretary or a scribe and becomes an eyewitness, because he's following with Peter. He's Paul. He's with Paul. He's on the missionary journey. He sees things for himself. And there are 3 different sections in the book where Luke switches to using, instead of they, he uses we. We went here, we did this, we moved on, and this kind of thing. And so during those times, has somebody got phone going off? Bet you that's a call from France, is it? During those times, Luke is with Paul. He's his friend, he's his traveling companion, he's his physician, and he's taking care of him. Now, it is clear, and we'll see this when we get a little bit further on, Luke meets Paul and Silas on Paul's second missionary journey. And we believe he's led to faith in Troas. And he joins them in Troas, and then they go to Philippi. And he saw for himself how in Philippi, Paul and Silas were arrested, thrown into prison, how they were flogged. No doubt he treated the wounds of the apostles and of Silas, and he takes care of him. Now, so his writing is accurate, his writing is stylish, and he writes this polished, classical Greek. The other thing about Luke is that he's very pro-women. In both the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, he always mentions women. If he knows their name, he gives their name. He speaks about them in a very admiring way. He's very pro-women in his approach, in a very male-dominated culture and society. So he's quite swimming against the tide in this thing. And his approach is very pro-women. So, to recap, who wrote the Acts of the Apostles? Luke. Where did he write it? Rome. Why did he write it? To give to Theophilus and to us the origins, the first steps, the first baby steps of the Christian church. And he writes accurately and reliably and specifically. And when did he write it? We believe he wrote it around AD 60, 61, 62. The scholars are not exactly sure, but that seems to be a good starting point. Around AD 60 was his start. Now, let me give you a bit of a structure of the book. See how the book breaks up. Now, in chapters 1 through 7, verse 60, you have the birth of the church. And then in chapters 8 through 12, you have the rise and growth of the church. And then in chapters 13 to 20, you have the expansion of the church as the church begins to go further and further and further. And then in chapters 20 to 28, you have the challenges of the church, the problems, the difficulties, the things that are troubling the early Christians, the false teaching that's coming in, and so on. So the last section is all about the challenges that the church begins. Now, I've discovered in life, the longer I've lived, that timing is all important in so many areas. And you can do the right thing at the wrong time, and it is completely ineffective. But if you do the right thing at the right time, the results can be remarkable. Now, in Galatians 4 and 4, Paul talks about when the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born in the law, that he might receive the full rights of sons. In other words, Paul is saying God launched his Son into planet Earth, into Israel. He had him be born at a very specific time, an important time, a vital time. What made it important? Well, what made it important, firstly, that at Jesus' baptism, he was filled with the Holy Spirit. When the apostles on the day of Pentecost, they're filled with the Holy Spirit. So that's the internal right time. Let's look at the external. What made Jesus' arrival in our world at that particular time? What helped? Very largely the ministry of the early church. Well, firstly, at that time, you had what's called the Pax Romana. You had the Roman peace. The Romans had conquered almost all the nations around the Mediterranean basin, and there were no significant wars. They had subdued the nations, they controlled countries, and so on. So you had what's called the Pax Romana. Then you had the Roman roads, which went all over the empire. Now, the Romans were great engineers. They built these roads to move, firstly, their troops quickly and efficiently from one troubled spot to another. But they were also brilliant for moving goods and supplies from one place to another. They had swept the pirates from the seas. And so when the apostles started to go out, they were traveling on Roman roads. They were sailing on Roman ships. They felt safe or safer than they had been before. So that was one factor. The Pax Romana, the Roman roads. The other vital thing was it was the first time in world history where you had a universal language, which was Greek. Latin was the official Roman language, but that was for legal documents and the law courts and things like that. Everyone else, if you wanted to communicate with the world, if you wanted to trade with the world, you had to learn Greek. And so Greek was the language of education, of culture, of theater, of arts, of commerce, of finance, and of the marketplace. So you had to understand Greek. It was the first universal language in history. Centuries later, in the world of diplomacy, when one government wanted to talk to another, especially in Europe, the language of diplomacy was French. You had to learn French, and you spoke and communicated. Even the Germans learned French. There's a surprise. So here was the perfect time. Here was the optimum time for the church to spread out, using all of these advantages: the Roman roads, the Roman peace, the ease of the use of language, and so on. So it was the perfect time for the church to begin and to grow. When Jesus goes back into heaven, there are 120 followers. And we're going to see how that is added to on the day of Pentecost. And think about this. You begin with 120 followers of Jesus. And within 300 years, the Christian church has swept the Greek and Roman gods from the temples of the world. And it has become the official religion of the Roman Empire. 300 short years, no time at all. And so the church goes from 120 people within that 300 years to certainly hundreds of thousands, almost certainly over 1 million. And so Luke is presenting to us what actually happened. And he's assuring, you notice how he says, take a look where he says about Jesus. He wants Theophilus to be sure that Jesus really was resurrected from the dead, not that it's not hopeful thinking. Notice what he says, verse 3. After his suffering, he showed himself to these men and gave many convincing proofs that he was alive. He appeared to them over a period of 40 days. Again, it wasn't a flash in the pan, wasn't one or two small appearances where people could be confused or bewildered. 40 days. They see him regularly over 40 days. They meet with him, they talk with him, they eat with him. This is what he means by many convincing proofs. Many, many eyewitnesses who saw Jesus. And as I say, it wasn't a story, it wasn't gossip, it wasn't wishful thinking, it was essential. And so here they are. Now, notice what Jesus says to them. He says, don't leave Jerusalem, but wait for the gift the Father promised, which you've heard from me. For John baptized with water, but in a few days you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit. Now, jump down to verse 7. He says, they're thinking parochially. Don't miss this. It's like that old phrase, you can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy. The disciples are Jews. And when Jesus starts talking about a kingdom, they're thinking they're a one-track mind. They're thinking about a Jewish kingdom, the restructuring, reestablishing of an independent Israel, kicking the Romans out, having their freedom, having their autonomy. They're thinking back to the glory days of David and so on. And is this what Jesus is promising? But Jesus is saying to them, look, fellas, stop thinking locally and think internationally. Lift your eyes up. Look at the possibilities. Look at where you're going to go. Now, this I always think is like throwing a pebble into a pond, and you watch the ripples go further and further and further out. Listen to him in verse 8. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit, there again is the emphasis, you're going to need this equipping. You're going to need this Holy Spirit. Otherwise, you'll be ineffective. And when it comes upon you, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, that's where they are, and in all Judea, that's a bit further, and then Samaria, that's a bit further still, and to the ends of the earth. You see the whole sweep of the thing. It's not going to be a Jewish kingdom. It's going to be a world kingdom. You're going to go out and share this good news. Now, this took a while for this to sink into the apostles because they were very focused, very Jewish, very parochial, and they're thinking only about, well, surely we're only supposed to tell Jews about Jesus. And it takes a lot for them to realize, no, that's not what Jesus intends. So he's telling them, lift your eyes, fellas. Stop thinking about a Jewish kingdom. That's not important. Think about the international situation. Thinking about taking the Gospels to Jews and Gentiles, to rich and poor, to slave and free. He's asking them to see with new eyes. And they're going to spread the church to every country, to every culture, and they're focused on the local things and so on. Their thoughts are on an earthly kingdom, another Davidic kingdom, where David was the great king who expanded the borders of the nation by winning battles. Now, Jesus is saying, lift your eyes, set your sights. God has bigger plans, and you're part of that plan, and you're going to be doing things you couldn't even imagine. Think about Peter. On our trip to Europe, we went to St. Peter's in Rome, and we wandered around St. Peter's in Rome, and we saw the statues and all the magnificence of it, and you think, well, this is all dedicated to Peter. Peter, the Galilean fisherman. Think about that. I mean, firstly, I don't think Peter ever was the first pope, but that's a whole different issue. But the fact that a whole bunch of our Roman Catholic brethren think he was. And the church proclaims that he was. But the point is, here's this most magnificent church. Who's it dedicated to? Peter, the Galilean fisherman. He would be astonished. He would shake his head in disbelief that this is what happened. And this is where, I mean, think of Peter actually going to Rome. If you'd have said to Peter when he was following Jesus, you know, Peter, one day you'll you'll preach the gospel in Rome, you'll talk about Jesus and so on, he would have said, oh, you're crazy. I'm just a fisherman. So Jesus is saying, lift your eyes, look at the situation, that we will reach these people. Now, the idea of reaching with religion, Jew and Gentile, Greek and Roman, men and women, rich and poor, slave and free, the same gospel to all of these people was very revolutionary 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years of church history has dumbed us to how extraordinary an idea that was. What an amazing thought that was. And so then, after giving him this word, let's take a look at verse 9. After he said this, Jesus was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid them from his sight. They were looking intently up into the sky. Who can blame them? As he was going, when suddenly two men dressed in white stood beside them. Men of Galilee, why do you stand here looking up into the sky? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way as you have seen him go into heaven. Now, the next verses, you have the selection of Matthias to replace Judas. Now, let's go down to verse 15. In those days, Peter stood up among the believers, a group numbering about 120, and said, brothers, the scriptures had to be fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit spoke about long ago through the mouth of David concerning Judas, who served as a guide to those who arrested Jesus. He was one of our number and shared in this ministry. With the reward that he got for his wickedness, Judas bought a field, and there he fell headlong. His body burst open and all his intestines spilled out. Everyone in Jerusalem heard this, and so they called that field in their language a field of blood. And Peter said, it is written in the book of the Psalms, may this place be deserted, let there be no one to dwell in it, and may another take his place of leadership. Therefore, it is necessary to choose one of the men who has been with us for the whole time that Jesus went in and out amongst us, beginning with John the Baptist, to the time when Jesus was taken up from us. One of these must become a witness with us of the resurrection. And so they proposed two men, Joseph called Barabbas, also known as Justus, and Matthias. And they prayed, Lord, you know everyone's heart. Show us which of these two you have chosen to take over this apostolic ministry, which Judas left to go where he belongs. And so they cast lots. And the lot fell to Matthias, and he was added to the 11 apostles. So, we're going to stop at that point because there's so much in chapter 2. It's the Holy Spirit coming upon the disciples and the beginning of their ministry, the beginning of being empowered by the Holy Spirit and so on. Does anyone have any questions at this point or any comments, anything you want to share? I'm tempted to tell you it was the first Congregational Church of Jerusalem, but they didn't have names. It was just the church, the followers. In Antioch, the name began Christians. That's where before that, the followers of Jesus were called the people of the way, W-A-Y, and then in Antioch they first called them Christians. Followers of Christos, the Christ. That was the idea. But they didn't have names in the way that we understand that. Anybody else? No? Oh, sorry. Yes. Absolutely. Well, see, there's another example of Luke being very careful to mention women, being gracious to women, including women. You see it a lot. We'll see more, we have seen more examples in the Gospels, where he's bringing women into the ministry of Jesus and how Jesus treats the women with respect and so on, in a way when that was not the everyday thing, and so on. But he's talking about the 120 men and women who are the nucleus, the beginning, the kernel of the church. Okay, we'll pick it up then. It'd be a good idea if you read chapter 2 for next week. And don't worry too much about struggling through all the names of the places that people are from verse 8 onwards. It mentions the Parthians, the Medes, the Elamites, people from Phrygia and Pamphylia and Egypt. You can just slot in Sun City and Peoria and that kind of thing in there. Yes? Yes. It was astonishing. Their minds were going, pfft. No. Well, that was my point about Peter going to Rome. If you'd have said to him, you're going to end up in Rome, the center of Roman power, the emperor and all the rest of it, and you're going to declare Jesus in Rome and in lots of other cities too, to Peter it would have been, oh, you're crazy. Would have been nuts, Okay, so we'll pick it up at chapter 2 then next week. Thank you so much, everybody.